John II Komnenos or Komnenos was Byzantine emperor from 1118 to 1143, also known as John the Beautiful or John the Good. He was the eldest son of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos and Irene Doukaina, and the second emperor to rule during the Komnenian restoration of the Byzantine Empire. John was a pious and dedicated monarch who was determined to undo the damage his empire had suffered following the Battle of Manzikert, half a century earlier. John has been assessed as the greatest of the Komnenian emperors. In the course of his 25-year reign, John made alliances with the Holy Roman Empire in the west, decisively defeated the Pechenegs, Hungarians and Serbs in the Balkans, and personally led numerous campaigns against the Turks in Asia Minor. John's campaigns fundamentally changed the balance of power in the east, forcing the Turks onto the defensive and restoring to the Byzantines many towns, fortresses and cities right across the peninsula. In the southeast, John extended Byzantine control from the Meander in the west all the way to Cilicia and Tarsus in the east. In an effort to demonstrate the Byzantine ideal of the emperor's role as the leader of the Christian world, John marched into Muslim Syria at the head of the combined forces of Byzantium and the Crusader states, yet despite the great vigor with which he pressed the campaign, John's hopes were disappointed by evasiveness of his Crusader allies and their reluctance to fight alongside his forces. Also under John, the empire's population recovered to about 10 million people. Unfortunately, John's reign is less well recorded by contemporary or near-contemporary writers than those of either his father, Alexios I, or his son, Manuel I. In particular, little is known of the history of John's domestic rule or policies, physical appearance and character. The Latin historian William of Tyre described John as short and unusually ugly, with eyes, hair and complexion so dark he was known as the Moor. Yet despite his physical appearance, John was known as Kallioannis, John the Good, or John the Beautiful. The epithet referred not to his body but to his character. Both his parents had been unusually pious and John surpassed him. Members of his court were expected to restrict their conversation to serious subjects only. The food served at the emperor's table was very frugal and John lectured courtiers who lived in excessive luxury. His speech was dignified, but he engaged in repartee on occasion and his seriousness did not exclude a sense of humor. As a father he was affectionate, though he demanded high standards from his children, and he was a faithful husband to his wife. Despite his personal austerity, John had a high conception of the imperial role and would appear in full ceremonial splendor when this was advantageous. He was highly respected and honored by his subjects. John was famed for his piety and his remarkably mild and just reign. He is an exceptional example of a moral ruler, at a time when cruelty was the norm. He is reputed never to have condemned anyone to death or mutilation. Charity was dispensed lavishly. For this reason, he has been called the Byzantine Marcus Aurelius. By the example of his personal purity and piety he effected a notable improvement in the manners of his age. Descriptions of him and his actions indicate that he had great self-control and personal courage. Accession to the throne. John II succeeded his father as ruling Basileus in 1118, but had already been proclaimed co-emperor by Alexios I on September 1, 1092. Nitas Choniates alone tells of the actions by which John II secured his own accession to power. Alexios I had favored John to succeed him over his wife Irene's favorite, the Caesar Nicephorus Bryennios, who was married to their daughter Anna Komnena. Alexios resorted to dissimulation in order to avert Irene's criticism of his choice and her demands that Nicephorus should succeed. As Alexios lay on his deathbed in the monastery of the Mungana on 15 August 1118, John, consorting with relatives whom he could trust, among whom was his brother, the Sebastocrator Isaac Komnenos, stole into the monastery and took the imperial signet ring from his dying father. Then, taking up arms, he rode to the great palace, gathering the support of the citizenry who acclaimed him emperor. Irene was taken by surprise and was unable either to persuade her son to desist, or to induce Nicephorus to act against him. Although the palace guard at first refused to admit John without proof of his father's wishes, the mob surrounding the new emperor simply forced entry. Alexios died the following night. John refused to join the funeral procession, in spite of his mother's urging, because his hold on power was so tenuous. However, in the space of a few days, his position seemed secure. Within a year of his accession, however, John II uncovered a conspiracy to overthrow him which implicated his mother and sister. Anna's husband Nicephorus had little sympathy with her ambitions, and it was his lack of support which doomed the conspiracy. Anna was stripped of her property, which was offered to the emperor's friend John Accession. Accession wisely declined, and his influence ensured that Anna's property was eventually returned to her and that John II and his sister became reconciled, at least to a degree. Irene retired to a monastery and Anna seems to have been effectively removed from public life, taking up the less active occupation of historian. However, Nicephorus remained on good terms with his brother-in-law. To safeguard his own succession, John crowned his young son Alexios co-emperor in 1122. Military and civil administration. The family intrigues that challenged his succession to the throne probably contributed to John's approach to rulership, which was to appoint men from outside the imperial family to help him govern the empire. This was a radical departure from the methods of his father, who had used the imperial family and its many connections to fill almost all senior administrative and military posts. John Accession was John II's closest advisor and was his only intimate friend. Accession was a Turk captured as a child at the siege of Nicaea, who had been given as a gift to John's father. Emperor Alexios had thought him a good companion for his son, and so he had been brought up alongside the prince in the imperial household. Accession was immediately appointed Grand Domestic, upon the accession of John II. The Grand Domestic was the commander-in-chief of the Byzantine armies. It has been suggested that references to Accession's possession of the imperial seal early in the reign of John's successor Manuel I meant that he was, in addition to his military duties, the head of the civil administration of the empire. This was an unofficial position known at the time as the Messazon, and equivalent to a vizier or prime minister. Such an appointment was remarkable, and a radical departure from the nepotism that had characterized the reign of Alexios I. The imperial family harbored some degree of resentment at this decision, which was reinforced by the fact that they were required to make obeisance to John Accession whenever they met him. The emperor had complete confidence in his appointees, many of whom had been chosen on merit rather than the connection to the imperial family and related aristocratic clans. John's unwillingness to allow his family to interfere too much in his government was to remain constant for the rest of his reign. John appointed a number of his father's personal retainers to high office, men such as Eustathius Camytses, Michaelitzes Stipiotes and George Stephanos. These were men who had been politically eclipsed during the ascendancy exercised by John's mother in the later years of the reign of Alexios I. A number of new men were raised to prominence by John II. These included Gregory Taranites, Manuel Anemas and Theodore Vatatzes. The latter two also became his sons-in-law. Despite his move away from close reliance on the imperial family and its connections, John's court and government had many similarities to that of his father, not least in its serious tone and piety. Indeed, an extant collection of political advice couched in poetic form, called the Musae, are attributed to Alexios I. The Musae address directly to John II and exhort him, amongst other things, to maintain justice during his reign and a full treasury. Alexios' advice on rulership therefore continued to be available to his son, even after the old emperor's death. The increase in military security and economic stability within Byzantine Western Anatolia, created by John II's campaigns, allowed him to begin the establishment of a formal provincial system in these regions. The theme of Accession was re-established with its administrative center at Philadelphia. A new theme, named Milosaron Melendodion, was created to the south of Accession. Diplomacy. The central tenet of the foreign policy of John II in the West was to maintain an alliance with the German emperors. This was necessary to limit the threat posed by the Normans of southern Italy to Byzantine territory in the Balkans. This threat became especially acute after Roger II of Sicily made himself supreme in southern Italy and assumed the title of king. Emperor Lothair III had Byzantine backing, including a large financial subsidy, for his invasion of Norman territory in 1136, which reached as far south as Bari. Pope Innocent II, with the Church's possessions in Italy under threat by Roger II, who supported anti-Pope Anacultus II, was also party to the alliance of Lothair and John II. However, this alliance proved unable to resist Roger, who extracted by force a recognition of his royal title from the Pope in 1139. Lothair's successor Conrad III was approached in 1140 for a royal German bride for John's youngest son Manuel. Bertha of Sulzbach, Conrad's sister-in-law, was chosen and dispatched to Byzantium. At much the same time, Roger II applied to John II for an imperial bride for his son, but was unsuccessful. John's penchant for interfering with his wife's family, the rulers of Hungary, was problematic. The welcome accorded to ousted claimants of the Hungarian throne in Constantinople was seen by the Byzantines as a useful insurance policy and source of political leverage. However, the Hungarians treated this interference as a fighting matter. A Hungarian alliance with the Serbs produced serious consequences for continued Byzantine dominance in the Western Balkans. In the east, John attempted, like his father, to exploit the differences between the Seljuk Sultan of Iconium and the Danish Mundid dynasty controlling the northeastern, inland parts of Anatolia. In 1134, the Seljuk Sultan Masud provided troops for John's attack on the Danish Mund-held city of Kastamuni. However, the alliance proved unreliable as the Seljuk troops abandoned the expedition, decamping during the night. In the Crusader states of the Levant, it was generally admitted that the Byzantine claims over Antioch were legally valid, though it was pragmatically viewed that only when the Byzantine emperor was in a position to enforce them militarily were they likely to be recognized in practice. The high point of John's diplomacy in the Levant was in 1137 when he extracted formal homage from the rulers of the Principality of Antioch, County of Edessa and the County of Tripoli. The Byzantine desire to be seen as holding a level of suzerainty over all of the Crusader states was taken seriously, as evidenced by the alarm shown in the Kingdom of Jerusalem when John informed King Fulk of his plan for an armed pilgrimage to the Holy City. Religious matters. The reign of John II was taken up with almost constant warfare and, unlike his father who delighted in active participation in theological and doctrinal disputes, John appears to have been content to leave ecclesiastical matters to the patriarch and the church hierarchy. Only when religion impinged directly on imperial policy, as in relations with the papacy and the possible union of the Greek and Latin churches, did John take an active part. He organized a number of disputations between Greek and Latin theologians. John, alongside his wife who shared in his religious and charitable works, is known to have undertaken church building on a considerable scale, including construction of the monastery of Christ Pantocrator in Constantinople. This monastery, with its 3 churches, has been described as one of the most important and influential architectural constructions of Middle Byzantine Constantinople. Attached to the monastery was a hospital, of 5 wards, open to people of all social classes. The hospital was staffed by trained layman doctors rather than monks. The monastery also served as the imperial sepulchre for the Komnenian dynasty. Very active persecution of the followers of the Paulician and Bogomil heresies characterized the last few years of the reign of Alexios I. No records from the reign of John mention such persecution, though countermeasures against heresy by the Byzantine Church remained in force. A permanent synod in Constantinople investigated the writings of a deceased monk named Constantine Chrysomelos, which had been circulating in certain monasteries. These works were ordered to be burnt by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Leo Stipes, in May 1140, on the grounds that they incorporated elements of Bogomil belief and practices. One of the few members of the imperial family to be placed in an important position by John was his cousin Adrian Komnenos. Adrian had become a monk and had accompanied John on his campaigns of 1138. Soon afterwards Adrian was appointed Archbishop of Bulgaria. Bulgaria was an autocephalous see and required a prestigious man as Archbishop.